In this video, we're going to be talking about language ideologies. We've spent the last few videos diving into the different facets of language from a linguistics perspective, but linguists also study language ideologies, which are attitudes, opinions, and beliefs toward a language and its speakers. And this is an area of linguistics that is of particular interest to me in my own work, looking at how bilingual children make sense of their bilingual learning experiences and develop opinions about language and beliefs about language. And it's something that certainly impacts our multilingual learners, both in terms of their development in English, but also the way in which their own home language or languages are perceived and viewed, and how that shapes their sense of self and their learning experiences. But the case study I wanted to talk through briefly is not focused on students coming into classrooms speaking languages other than English, such as Spanish or Arabic, but I want to look at standard American English versus African American vernacular English, or AVE, or sometimes it's also called simply African American English or Black English, because I think this gets at some of the nuances a little bit more between language ideologies and also language and power in shaping how languages are perceived and even interpreted. Specifically, why one is considered a standard and the other is considered a dialect, or worse, even considered to be bad English. And in the chapter that you read for today, Wayne Wright provided various scenarios at the beginning of the chapter, and one of them was an African American student who was using African American vernacular English in his interactions with the teacher, saying things like, "I'm going to ask you a question," and "why whales have blowholes." And so in both of these, the student is using Black English. He's using the dialect that he speaks to ask this question. In African American vernacular English, the K and the S in the word ask are switched like that. Ax is a normal way of using that word. Removing words like am and do also is part of a systematic way that the language operates. And yet, even though this is the way that Black English is spoken, many people who don't have an understanding of this, or a belief of this as a language in and of itself or a dialect, view it as just a bad form of English, or don't quite understand that the student is using an actual home language that the student speaks with members of his family and his community. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time in this video talking about African American vernacular English, because so much has been researched about AVE as a language, and yet I find that many of the students that I work with haven't been exposed to this research or heard about this research before taking this class. In the 1980s, there was a lot of work done to really understand AVE, to document it linguistically in all of the ways that we've just been talking about, looking from the lens of phonology, morphology, syntax. And what they have found, what linguists found, is that it is a rule-governed language. It's systematic like any other language. It has particular rules that are followed, and in some ways is more complex than standard American English. This is a quote from Toni Morrison, where she was talking about her frustration with the fact that AVE is not always viewed as a language or validated as a language. She said in this interview, "There are certain things I cannot say without recourse to my language. It's terrible to think that a child with 5 different present tenses comes to school to be faced with books that are less than his own language, and then to be told things about his language, which is him, that are sometimes permanently damaging. That is a really cruel fallout of racism." And I love how she says here, "which is him." I think it goes back to what we talked about the very first class, that language is so tied to who we are. How we speak is so tied to our own identities. And I wanted to get into what she said here a little bit more. So when she talks about 5 different present tenses, what she's referring to is research showing that there are 5 different present tenses within African American vernacular English, which makes it more complex than standard American English. So here's an example of what that means. So in Black English, you can use the present progressive by removing the helping verb or the copula be. So instead of saying she is talking, just saying she talkin' is present progressive, which means she is talking. If you say she be talking, that means she usually is talking. So it's the habitual progressive. If you say she be steady talking, that means she's usually talking in an intensive, sustained manner. If you say she been talking, that means she has been talking, but she isn't talking right now. And if you say she been talking, that means she's been talking for a while and she's still talking. So each of these nuances and how the word be is employed or not employed shapes the present tense that's being used, which makes this a more complex way of very clearly expressing what is meant in the present moment, indicating time period and tense, than standard American English. And yet, children who speak Black English, who speak African American vernacular English, are often viewed as not speaking good English, and all to start with, and often not recognized as speaking a dialect of English that is complex and rule governed and unique to the speakers of that language. So rather than here getting into kind of the challenges and the solutions, I just want to leave you with a few questions. First and foremost, what language ideologies do we hold towards students' home languages? I think it's important to think about this question. What beliefs we have about that language and those language speakers, if we think that people who speak that language are intelligent or not, if we have assumptions about what people are who speak that language, because that shapes how we think about the students themselves. So language ideologies certainly play a role in the classroom and in language learning. And also, going back to multilingual learners, what misunderstandings we hold about bilingualism and multilingualism. So we certainly, I think, collectively hold misunderstandings about Black English, and in terms of viewing it as a legitimate language and understanding its use in the classroom and how you might support students who speak it. But there's also misunderstandings about bilingualism and multiculturalism. And one of the main understandings that was discussed in the chapter was this idea that a student who is bilingual is working towards, who speaks a language other than English and is learning English, is working towards becoming a double monolingual, fully proficient in English, fully proficient in Spanish, and that is what bilingualism is. And research has clearly shown that that is not what bilingualism is. That doesn't mean that bilingual people can't develop competency in two languages, but being bilingual is a dynamic process. Languages are not separate. The person does not become a double monolingual. In fact, research has shown that bilingual language use is very dynamic. And Ofelia Garcia terms this translanguaging, and we'll talk about that more in class. But this ability to draw from all of the language features that are part of their repertoire to make meaning. So what some have referred to, for example, as Spanglish, Ofelia Garcia and others would argue is just a natural way of doing and being bilingual for people who know more than one language or have more than one language that as part of their repertoire. So we'll talk a little bit more about language ideologies in class as well, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview and with the case study as we think about how the beliefs and attitudes that we hold towards languages and language users might shape the way in which we perceive the people who speak them and the ways in which we understand those students in the classroom. And that is all for now.